Something unusual happened yesterday in Iowa. President Donald Trump stood before hundreds of supporters and spent an entire hour talking about the economy, tax cuts, and energy policy. He bragged about making people rich. He promised lower prices. He warned Republicans that losing the midterms would cost them everything they've worked for. On paper, this was exactly what the White House wanted: a reset, a pivot, a chance to change the narrative from controversy to accomplishment, from crisis to celebration, from Minneapolis to the middle of America's heartland. But here's what makes this story fascinating. While Trump was on stage in Clive, Iowa, talking about rising home values and falling gas prices, hundreds of protesters stood outside, holding signs demanding answers about 2 Americans killed by federal immigration agents in Minneapolis. While he celebrated his economic record, his administration was simultaneously managing one of the biggest political crises of his second term. While he promised affordability, Americans across the country were asking a very different question: when will there be accountability? This is the story of a president trying to turn the page, trying to shift focus, trying to make Americans forget what happened 3 days ago and look forward to what might happen 9 months from now in the midterm elections. And the fascinating part isn't whether it will work. The fascinating part is watching it happen in real time. Let's start with what actually occurred in Iowa. Trump arrived Tuesday afternoon at the Horizon Event Center in Clive, a suburb of Des Moines. Before his speech, he stopped at a local restaurant called The Machine Shed in nearby Urbandale. He met with locals. He sat for an interview with Fox News. He ate. He smiled. He did what politicians do when they're trying to appear relatable and down to earth. But even there, even at a casual restaurant visit meant to show him connecting with everyday Americans, the questions wouldn't stop. Reporters kept asking about Alex Priddy, the 37-year-old ICU nurse who was shot and killed by Border Patrol agents in Minneapolis just 3 days earlier. The U.S. citizen who administration officials initially called a domestic terrorist, an assassin, someone who intended to massacre federal law enforcement. Trump's response at the restaurant was telling. He distanced himself from his own Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller. Miller had posted on social media calling Priddy an assassin who tried to murder federal agents. Vice President J.D. Vance had shared that post. But when reporters asked Trump directly if he believed Priddy was an assassin, Trump said no. When asked if the killing was justified, Trump called it a very sad situation and said a big investigation was underway. Then Trump said something that immediately created another firestorm. He said Priddy certainly shouldn't have been carrying a gun. He said he didn't like that Priddy had a gun. He didn't like that Priddy had 2 fully loaded magazines. He called it a lot of bad stuff. Think about that for a moment. Alex Priddy was a U.S. citizen exercising his Second Amendment right to carry a firearm. Minnesota is an open-carry state. Priddy had a valid permit. He broke no laws by having that gun. And yet the President of the United States, a Republican who has built his entire political brand on defending the Second Amendment, suggested that carrying a legal firearm was somehow problematic, that it justified suspicion, that it made a tragic situation somehow understandable. The reaction from gun rights advocates was immediate and fierce. This wasn't just about Alex Priddy anymore. This was about whether the Trump administration believes Americans actually have the right to carry firearms without being treated as threats. This was about whether the Second Amendment applies equally to everyone or only to people the government approves of. But Trump didn't dwell on that controversy at the restaurant. He moved on. He got in his motorcade. He headed to the Horizon Events Center. And when he took the stage, he did exactly what his staff wanted him to do. He talked about the economy. Trump spent an hour celebrating what he called the greatest first year of any administration in the country's history. He talked about the massive tax and spending bill passed last year. He took credit for the soaring stock market. He said he made a lot of people rich, including some he doesn't even like. He talked about rising home values. He talked about declining gas prices. He talked about defeating inflation. He promoted his tariffs. He highlighted deals with drug makers to lower prescription costs. He promised to protect ethanol producers. He championed Iowa farmers. And crucially, he framed all of this as being at risk if Republicans lose the midterms. He told the crowd that if they lose in November, they'll lose all the things they're talking about. This was the message. This was the pivot. This was Trump trying to make the 2026 midterms about economic success instead of immigration controversy. But even during that speech, even as he stayed mostly on message, Trump couldn't resist revealing what he really thinks. He suggested that concerns about affordability were exaggerated by political opponents. He said the word affordability was something people only started hearing a few months ago. He dismissed it as a talking point rather than a genuine concern millions of Americans face every day. This is classic Trump. Even when he's trying to stay disciplined, even when he's reading from prepared remarks, he veers off into tangents that undermine his own message. He was in Iowa to talk about making things affordable, and in the same speech, he suggested affordability isn't really a problem. Now, let's talk about what was happening outside that event center while Trump was speaking inside. Hundreds of protesters gathered. They held signs, they chanted, they demanded accountability. Many of the signs referenced Renee Good and Alex Pretty, the two Americans killed by federal immigration agents in Minneapolis this month. Other signs demanded the release of more files related to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. Others called for immigration officers to be removed from Minneapolis entirely. One protester, Shirley Keenan from Des Moines, told reporters she's upset with how the Department of Homeland Security is treating people who are detained as part of the president's immigration crackdown. She said Trump needs to have a heart and follow the Constitution. She said Congress needs to act as a co-equal branch of government. That last point is crucial. This isn't just about immigration enforcement anymore. This is about checks and balances. This is about whether Congress has any power to constrain executive agencies. This is about whether the Constitution still means what it says, or whether it's become optional. And the protest in Iowa wasn't an isolated event. Across Minnesota, protests have continued daily since Alex Pretty was killed. Memorials for both Good and Pretty remain standing in Minneapolis. More than $1.5 million has been donated to a GoFundMe campaign for Pretty's family in just 3 days. Lawmakers from both parties are demanding investigations. Federal judges are threatening to hold ICE officials in contempt of court for violating orders. This is not going away. This is not fading from the news cycle. And that's why Trump's Iowa speech is so revealing. Because it shows us the strategy. Change the subject. Pivot to the economy. Make it about the midterms. Make it about what you've accomplished rather than what went wrong. Make it about the future instead of the past 3 weeks. But here's the problem with that strategy. The American people can hold two thoughts in their heads at the same time. They can care about the economy and also care about Americans being killed in the street by federal agents. They can want lower prices and also want accountability. They can support border security and also oppose unconstitutional tactics. And increasingly, even Republicans are struggling to defend what happened in Minneapolis. Republican Senator Rand Paul, chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, has called for the officers involved in Pritty's shooting to be placed on administrative leave immediately. He's demanding an independent investigation. He's called the heads of 3 Department of Homeland Security agencies to testify before his committee on February 12th. Republican Senator Tom Tillis publicly stated he doesn't think Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem should keep her job. Republican Representative Mike Lawler wrote an op-ed in the New York Times calling for Congress and Trump to embrace a new, comprehensive national immigration policy. The conservative editorial boards of both the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal have condemned the administration's response. This isn't Democrats attacking Trump. This is his own party saying something has gone wrong. Something needs to change. Something cannot continue the way it's been going. And that brings us back to Iowa. Trump went to Iowa because Iowa matters for the midterms. Iowa has 4 competitive U.S. House races. Iowa has an open U.S. Senate seat. Control of Congress could come down to what happens in Iowa this November. And Trump knows that his political power depends on Republicans maintaining control. So he went to Iowa to rally the base, to remind them of tax cuts, to promise them continued prosperity, to warn them that Democrats will take it all away if they win, to make the election about economics instead of about 2 dead Americans in Minneapolis. Will it work? That's the question everyone's asking, and the answer depends on something we won't know for months. It depends on whether the Minneapolis crisis continues to escalate or whether the administration can successfully contain it. It depends on whether more Americans are killed by federal agents or whether the new border czar Tom Homan can restore calm. It depends on whether Congress forces accountability through investigations or whether the controversy fades. But here's what we know right now. The Trump administration is worried. They're worried enough to send Trump to Iowa 3 days after a U.S. citizen was killed by Border Patrol agents. They're worried enough to remove Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino from Minneapolis and send him back to California. They're worried enough to dispatch Tom Homan and Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Rodney Scott to manage operations on the ground in Minnesota. They're worried enough to have Trump distance himself from Stephen Miller's inflammatory rhetoric. They're worried enough to announce they're going to de-escalate a little bit in Minnesota. They're worried enough to schedule calls between Trump and Democratic Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. And perhaps most tellingly, they're worried enough to try this pivot to the economy, to try to change the subject, to try to make Americans look forward instead of backward. Republican strategist Ryan Williams, who helped lead Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, said something important to reporters this week. He said the primary news story at the moment isn't just the shooting, it's the response to the shooting. That's what's dominating headlines. That's what's driving the controversy. That's what's creating problems for the administration. And Williams is right. If the administration had responded differently, if they had expressed caution instead of immediately defending the killing, if they had promised a thorough investigation instead of calling the victim a domestic terrorist, if they had acknowledged complexity instead of claiming clear justification, This story might already be fading, but they didn't do any of that. They went on offense. They attacked the victim. They justified the use of force. They suggested that lawfully carrying a firearm makes you a legitimate target. And then, when the evidence contradicted their claims, when body cam footage and Department of Homeland Security reports showed their narrative was false, they didn't apologize. They pivoted. They sent Trump to Iowa to talk about the economy. They're hoping Americans will focus on tax cuts instead of killings. They are betting that economic messaging will overcome accountability concerns. They're gambling that 9 months from now, when voters head to the polls for the midterms, they'll remember rising home values and falling gas prices instead of 2 Americans shot dead in Minneapolis. Maybe that bet will pay off. Maybe Americans will prioritize economics over everything else. Maybe the economy really will be booming by November, and voters will reward Republicans for it. Or maybe Americans will remember. Maybe they'll remember that 2 U.S. citizens were killed by federal agents this month. Maybe they'll remember that the administration's first instinct was to lie about why. Maybe they'll remember that when confronted with evidence, the response wasn't accountability, but distraction. We'll find out in November. The midterm elections will tell us whether Trump's Iowa strategy worked, whether the pivot to the economy succeeded, whether Americans bought the message or saw through it. But for now, for this moment in late January 2026, the story is clear. A president is trying to turn the page. A president is trying to change the subject. A president is trying to make you forget what happened 3 days ago and focus on what might happen 9 months from now. Whether you let him do that is up to you.